Hi, my name's Jackie Jarvis. I sit on the Rural, Regional and Remote Women's Network, and I'm also a regional business owner. And today I've been asked to host a panel discussion about regional business resilience. This program is part of a grant that was provided by the WA State Government as part of the National Disaster Resilience Program, and it's funded under a national agreement in partnership with the WA State Government and the Commonwealth. We're going to be talking today about the business community's awareness of risk and how natural hazards and disasters may impact your business. I have three expert panellists with me today. First up we have Rachael Lincoln. Hi Rachael.
Hello Jackie.
Rachel's a Senior Risk and Safety Consultant with Chamber of Commerce and Industry WA, otherwise known as CCI. Rachael has a Masters in Occupational Health and Safety, and Rachael works with businesses of all shapes and sizes across regional Western Australia. Also from CCI we have Karin Lee. Hi Karin.
Hi Jackie.
Karin is a qualified legal practitioner, and at CCI she manages the safety and risk team. Karin's got over 15 years experience working in the area of occupational health and safety, workers' compensation and injury management, and Karin sits on a number of state government boards and committees to provide advice. And finally we have Brad Miles. Hi.
Hi Jackie.
Brad is a District Officer with the Department of Fire and Emergency Services, otherwise known as DFES. He's been a career firefighter for over 18 years, and he has a diploma in public safety firefighting management, and also works with industry as a workplace trainer. So Brad, can you tell us more about DFES and its role?
Certainly Jackie. DFES is the leading hazard management agency in Western Australia. It is made up of the Career Fire and Rescue Service, the Volunteer Fire and Rescue Service, the Bushfire Service, State Emergency Service and the Volunteer Marine Rescue Service. Operates across the state 24 hours a day, responds to emergencies. We have about 1,100 career firefighters, and we also have about 29,000 volunteers.
Okay, so those volunteers are obviously spread throughout the regions?
Absolutely, across all areas and in all of those agencies that I mentioned, so Bushfire, Fire and Rescue, SES, right across the state.
Okay, and how valuable are those volunteers to your operations?
Look, absolutely imperative. We rely very heavily on volunteers, and particularly in the regions, it is mostly all volunteers.
So then at what point, obviously in lots of regional areas the volunteers are first on site, at what point does DFAS come in and take over or take control of the situation?
Well, the volunteer groups have their own rank and file structure, and when they respond, they pretty much manage most emergencies themselves. When it escalates, then a DFES manager will attend. Most of those volunteers will stay at the incident ground, and they'll be supported by DFES management.
Fantastic. So if DFAS aren't on the ground yet, then regional businesses and the community should be listening to their volunteers, their volunteer fire brigade or their SES for instructions.
Absolutely, yes. Those people will be in charge of the incident. They do have legislated powers as volunteers to take charge of emergency incidents. So yes, they should listen to them. Okay.
So those legislated powers, can you explain a little bit what that means about, is that around evacuation?
There are many powers. It's very broad under different acts. There's the Fire Brigades Act, the FESA Act and the Emergency Management Act, and those different groups have different powers under each of those acts. They have powers of evacuation, powers of entry, and power to take charge of an incident, powers to shut roads, etc. So it is really quite broad.
Okay, so it would be certainly worth, I suppose, regional businesses understanding that and knowing that who they need to take direction from, and if a volunteer emergency service personnel gives them instructions, they need to adhere to that.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, excellent. Yep. So now talking about volunteers, Karin, obviously businesses may have staff who are volunteers. How would they manage that?
It's definitely a conversation to have before an emergency arises, so certainly employers would want to understand who on their staff might volunteer and what kind of emergencies they might volunteer for. Also to have a better understanding of who may or may not be available during an emergency for them at the workplace and who may be called up to be part of the response. Certainly businesses also need to be aware they may have obligations to actually continue to pay employees or make particular payments to them while they are participating in declared emergencies, and depending on the type of volunteer and the role that they play, that could be for a substantial period of time, so that could impact on how well the business can continue to operate if that person is a critical part of production or a critical part of actually running the business. So it is something that employers need to be aware of and plan around for their own business continuity or continuing to operate when an emergency arises.
So, talking about volunteers, I mean, I suppose when there's an emergency in your town or your district, everyone wants to help out. You're talking there about, you know, knowing who are registered volunteers. Is that important?
Absolutely, that's very important, because there are different types of people who will volunteer for different types of emergencies depending on the kind of skill set that they have or their particular regional location. And certainly the last thing that you want is for people to start managing emergencies if they haven't actually had the right training or they aren't actually prepared to do that well for you at your workplace, but also more broadly in a community regional response. Certainly, Brad, I would expect that you really only want registered volunteers to participate in actual emergency response on a broader scale.
Absolutely, Karin, that's very important. Our volunteers are registered, and they do go through a process, and that involves training. There's an amount of training that they have to complete before they can go to an incident, and this is primarily for their safety and the safety of other people on the incident ground.
So we know that businesses should know who their volunteers are, perhaps have a register of volunteers so that they can make plans. What are some other things that you do at CCI with regards to how businesses can be resilient when these sort of emergencies happen?
Well, businesses often will need a little bit of help to actually identify those kinds of foreseeable events that could be considered an emergency or a disaster that could impact on their capacity either to keep operating or to quickly restart operating after the event has occurred. We at CCI help employers to identify foreseeable risks, to classify the kinds of events that may occur and to identify the risk for their particular business in that kind of event. We can help employers to plan out how they might respond to particular types of emergencies, because obviously different emergencies will require different response and potentially different people to be involved.
Excellent. I might just pass on to Rachael, because I know Rachael spends a lot of time out in the regions and dealing with businesses. How does that work practically? How can, what's your personal experience with dealing with small business and how they can prepare?
With my role at CCI, I have been lucky enough to travel to a number of regions, particularly the Goldfields, Midwest, Wheatbelt and the Kimberleys. And with my experience going to the regions, it's not that they're not prepared for emergencies, it's that they sometimes don't realise they need to make a conscious effort to be prepared, and sometimes it's just the fact that they don't know what they should have, they seek the information, and that's sort of how I've been able to help them. So they've sought the advice, I've gone out and I've seen them, and most of the things, it's really practical stuff we do. We go to the business and we say, right, if this happened, if we identified the hazard, there's a fire, what sort of things have we got to be prepared? So for example, I was at a workplace in Laverton. They had a first aid kit, great. Everything in it had expired. Okay. So that was a bit unfortunate. They had the first aid kit, expired goods and no first aid officer, so no one actually there to be able to administer the first aid. They had a few things prepared in terms of how to manage a fire. So they had the fire escapes, they even had a muster point and everyone knew where it was. And so I said, what about the fire extinguishers? We had a fire extinguisher that was there, wonderful, it had been serviced, but it was in a box that was locked without a key. So it's those sort of things when I've actually gone to the regions, it's they want to do the right thing, they're just seeking that advice, and they're seeking that advice from somebody who has had experience in the regions and sort of knows the struggles or the I guess the things that make it a bit more difficult to be prepared than it does for those businesses in the metro area. It's
great story there. Brad, you do you see businesses sometimes that aren't quite as prepared as they should be in your day-to-day?
Oh, sometimes, Jackie. I like to think most are prepared or try to prepare, and that's really the key, is to have a plan in place pre-incident, so that when something does happen, the business is pretty much ready to go.
Excellent. Now, talking about something that might happen, perhaps you can share the experience of where a natural disaster has impacted on businesses and communities, just so we all have a bit of an understanding of what the impact can be.
Yes, I'd like to talk about the Parkerville bushfire, Jackie. The Parkerville bushfire occurred in January 2014 in the community of Parkerville. Involved about 350 hectares of land was burnt. There were 57 homes lost. There was considerable damage to critical infrastructure such as power poles, the telecommunications system, water, and most of the critical infrastructure in the community. Had a big impact on that community. There was about 1,400 people were registered at the evacuation centre, so they were disrupted for quite a while. From the time the fire started until the time the fire was actually blacked out and declared safe was 21 days. So that had a big impact on the community. There were roads blocked. They're blocked for a reason. A lot of trees that lined the roads were dangerous. There were limbs that could fall, etc. There were power poles down, so people really couldn't access that incident ground.
So can I just interrupt you there?
Sure.
You said 21 days until it was blacked out. What does that term blacked out mean?
Blacked out is a term we use. It really means the fire has been cooled. It's a process where we go through and practically put out everything that is burning within the fire ground. So
if a business thinks that, well, the fire's been put out, I should be able to get back to my business premises or to my farm or to my property, it could still be a period of time before that can actually happen.
Absolutely, there could be quite a delay, even days or weeks afterwards, because it's mainly the safety issue, things like power lines down, etc. Mainly the roads will be blocked, and the first people we let in is the power companies, is one of the first, and they will restore the power, and everything then rolls off that. So and this can take weeks sometimes. Yeah,
look, I live in Margaret River, and I certainly remember when we had the fires there in Margaret River, getting the power back on was something that I don't think people had anticipated. So again, there was that presumption that as soon as the fire is out and it's safe, that you can go back to normal life. But things like that, like power, water, phone towers, they obviously can take some time. Oh, absolutely, and that is a big impact on a business. You know, a business can't do anything with power without fridges and motors, machinery. So the business is pretty well brought to a halt. Okay, Karin, obviously this is your area of expertise about business resilience. So we know that perhaps if there is a fire or a flood or a storm, it might not just be the initial event, but it could go on for some time. How can businesses prepare so that they can, I guess, operate as normally as possible, as soon as possible?
Well, Jackie, it's not always easy to identify your risks and your obligations, particularly if your business is also your home, or you live very in close proximity to where you operate your business. So it really is a matter of understanding the kinds of things that could occur, working out what you can control and making sure that you do actually control those things that are within your power, and those things that aren't able to be controlled by you, whether they might be things such as the emergency response that's coordinated by DFES, you may be directed to leave your premises and not be able to go back, or it may be that critical services aren't available. You just need to be aware of those things and make some plans around how you will deal with any interruptions to your normal operation. In particular, from an employer's perspective, there are obviously things that you do need to think about when it comes to business continuity, such as how will you continue to pay your staff? Who do you pay if they are casual and you can't offer them hours? How do you access information about your insurance documents, for example, if you've sustained some damage or if there is a loss as a result of interruption to business? Also, clients and their expectations, how are you able to communicate with them to let them know what's happened and maintain your working relationship with your clients so that that's not damaged just because you've had an interruption, which may be temporary or it may be much longer term.
And I think that's an important point, because I think a lot of regional businesses in Western Australia might be dealing with clients from a long way away or from overseas or from interstate who might not even be aware that there is something happening in your part of the world.
Yes, absolutely. So it is important to think about who might be affected by an interruption in your normal operations and think about how you can mitigate any kind of damage or loss that might result from that interruption before anything happens.
Rachel, could you add some more practical tips?
Yeah, absolutely. So on a practical level, when an emergency happens, often you don't have time to think about what do I need, time to shop for those things. So you have to sort of think about, okay, if there is an emergency that happens in 2 hours' time, I need to have stuff there in my emergency response kit, for lack of a better word, that will help me make sure that I can get my staff, my employees, my visitors safe from my business. And that would be things like a first aid kit, having somebody trained in first aid, having water available, having even a contact card so you can contact your other staff, next of kin, phone numbers, email addresses, things like that, so you can actually keep in touch with your staff when they've, if there is an emergency, just so that they know what's going on in terms of at their workplace. Lots of things like in preparation for an emergency, so doing the practical things like, if there was an emergency and we needed to get out of this building, this is the way we'd go. This is the door that must always remain unblocked. This is where we need to muster because this is the safe point. This is the person who you need to listen to or who has been trained to be the warden to direct you to safety. So it's thinking about what are the emergencies, how can we make sure preservation of life is obviously the key. How can we make sure the people in the business, our staff, our employees, our visitors can get out safely, and make sure that once they're out of the building, what can we do to make sure that they're not going to be in any harm's way.
So Rachel, that's some really good advice about being prepared and evacuating staff. What happens after the staff evacuated but you still can't get into your business? You know, Brad mentioned that at Parkerville it was up to 21 days before people could get back to their business premises. So what happens 2 or 3 days out when everyone's safe but you've still got a business to run? How can that happen?
Absolutely. So as I said before, the key factor is the preservation of life. 2 to 3 days after that's sorted, so the next priority would be business continuity and getting things back together. So it would be something about, prior to the emergency, identifying who could be the suppliers, who could be the contractors, who are the people that we can call upon to help us get our business back and functioning and safe for our staff and our employees. And that's why it's really important to do some preparation and identify who these people are that can assist you, and also having these contact cards for your employees to make sure that you can consistently get in touch with them, communicate with them, and keep them in the loop, because that's really important. Your staff are your key to getting the business back up and running.
Now I know that my business is everything I know and understand about my business is all contained on a computer. Obviously these days there's a lot of cloud-based software. Does that have a role to play?
Definitely. So when you're thinking about your preparation for evacuation, it would be about identifying those key things that keep your business ticking. And it might be a server, for example, or it might be a filing cabinet with a special top secret file in the back corner. It's about identifying what are those things that you need to keep your business, that can assist you in getting your business back up and running as quickly as possible. Whatever those things are, identify them, have them in your emergency response documents, so you know who the fire warden is, what the documents are that you need to grab, if it's the server, if it's the disk. Have those things written down so that if there is an emergency and you do need to evacuate, you have a plan. That plan's been practiced. People know their roles, they know their responsibilities. It's there, it's documented, it's known. So when there is an emergency, it's nothing new. People know the order to follow and can think about those business critical pieces of software or documents or whatever it may be, so that they can come with you when you evacuate.
Excellent. Now, Brad, I'm going to come over to you. I, as well as living in Margaret River when they had the bushfires, I actually also lived in Busselton when they had the floods, and I don't think it's just natural disasters following me. I think I think that's perhaps the experience a lot of people across regional WA have been involved in emergencies like that. I certainly remember from the Busselton floods, we left the house at 8 o'clock in the morning thinking we were just going through a little bit of knee-deep water, and that we would get a few groceries and be back at home by 9 a.m. and when we went back, the SES had shut down the whole the whole suburb where I lived, and we couldn't get back in, and didn't have any I guess clothes or anything with us. Do you see that situation where you see people who are quite keen to get back to their businesses or their properties for a number of reasons, and how does that manage itself?
Absolutely, we see that often, Jackie, at our emergency incidents, and there comes a point where we will have to block the road, and people are locked out. They can't get back in. We do sometimes have partial roadblocks, but they're mostly full roadblocks, and it's there for a reason. It's because it's not safe in that area, so people can't get back in. I suppose the key for people is to stay informed. If you know that there's something developing, in this instance a flood, there is time to prepare. So the best source of information is the DFES website.
Okay.
And what we say is there's one message, one source. So if you go to the website, that'll be the most accurate, and that is where all the other agencies will get their information from. So you can monitor the progress of the incident, the flood, the bushfire, etc., from that website, and you can plan ahead. So we try to give you as much warning as possible. We have a warning infrastructure which puts messages out over the internet, over radio, over TV, and we can even send it to your mobile phone in extreme emergencies.
Well, we've definitely come a long way, because I can tell you, when 1998 there was no smartphones when we had to leave that flood area in Busselton. So I think we've got a lot of tools at our fingertips that make it a much easier process. Karin, we've talked a little bit about business planning and why it's important. You know, I guess expanding on what we've talked about people having to leave and then not be able to get back into their business. What's some of the other things that businesses can do around, you know, not only once the disasters happen, but getting back to business?
Businesses generally will try to resume operations fairly quickly, but there can be a variety of different obstacles that they need to overcome, and as Brad mentioned, it may be that areas are blocked off and you can't get to your usual workplace. With a lot of regional locations, you don't generally have the same access to immediate support and services that you might have access to in the metro area, so it is important that businesses, again from a planning perspective, know who their insurer is, who their bank is, and who the contact people are there, even if they can't get to their normal office, and locate that information, so that if they do need to make contact with someone to understand how to make a claim or how to actually get some support, then those sorts of things are available to them straight away at that critical point when they need it.
So Karin, obviously we've talked about being able to contact banks and insurance companies and things like that, and Rachel's mentioned the importance of being in regular contact with your staff.
Yes.
What about the issue of a duty of care to staff? I could imagine that there would be some businesses, perhaps where you've got a really dedicated staff member who perhaps wants to stay behind. If it's a farming business, there might be livestock involved. Where do businesses stand with regards to a duty of care to those employees and making sure that they are safe, and also in the recovery phase?
Well, employers do have an obligation to provide a safe workplace, and even when circumstances change, that obligation continues. So you do have to make sure that you don't expose your employees and other people at your workplace, whether that's your farm or whether it's a shop or another work location, to any kind of danger that you can control or avoid. So it is important that employers recognise their obligation in this space and take appropriate steps to identify, assess and control the risks to people's safety and health. If you've got, for example, as you mentioned, a staff member who's very keen to stay behind even though there has been an evacuation declared or required, then really from a business perspective that's not a good risk to take, and it will become a question then of whether or not you're going to be able to provide that person with safety, and provide them with a safe environment and safe situation while they remain at the property, essentially still in their employment, if you're directing them to stay. So we would strongly urge all employers and business owners to liaise with DFES and or potentially the volunteer coordinators who are actually managing the particular event, to make sure that you don't put people in the line of danger, and if they can and need to be evacuated, that's done as soon as possible, because there is an obligation to continue to provide a safe working environment.
And Brad, I think you mentioned earlier that people could actually be breaking the law if they stay in an area where they've been evacuated.
That's right. Once the roadblocks are in place and an evacuation has been directed, you would be breaking the law by being in there. Yes.
Okay. We've touched briefly on fire, we've talked about Parkerville, and we've spoken about flood, but I think people sometimes forget that storms can cause significant damage and also can cause emergency. Do you have any comment on storm damage that can happen across the state?
Absolutely, storm is a real risk in the southwest of WA, and particularly in the winter months, is frequent cold fronts etc. come across, and there's considerable storm damage. Once again, there is warning by the Bureau of Meteorology, provides warning. And the key is to have a plan in place and to make sure you enact that plan once you've had warning that there could be a storm hit. Okay.
So Brad was obviously talking about storms. So Rachel, with storm warnings, we obviously do quite often get a day or two or at least a few hours notice. What can businesses do who perhaps want to get themselves prepared but also have staff who want to go home and make sure their own family and their own property is safe? Have you got any advice there?
Absolutely. Well, most employers allow the flexibility for their staff to go home. And what I would advise is that the employers need to make sure it is actually safe for their employees to go home. We don't want to let them leave the safe environment of a workplace and then say if there's a storm coming in that it'll be less safe for them to be on the road going home. So we need to look at what's going to be the safest for them, and absolutely an employer is going to be flexible and make sure that the employee can go home and look after their own home. Yeah, absolutely. But what my advice is to make sure that it is actually safe for the employee to travel home.
And obviously the businesses involved would have already been prepared because they've followed our
They've done all the right things, and they've got their plans in place, and they're trained and they're prepared and they've documented, and everyone knows them. What's required of them leading up to the flood or the storm.
So we've talked a bit about before, what happens before an emergency, and this is obviously, these plans should be in place and I guess reviewed regularly?
Absolutely. So the best time to review it is after something bad's happened. So I do say, once you've done the documentation, you've got the plan, make sure that it is reviewed annually but particularly review it after it's been implemented, been put in place, and you've needed to follow it. So after an emergency, because that's when the time is that you'll get your lessons, you'll realise actually this didn't work as it should have, or this perhaps needed to be tweaked, or this needs to be changed, or this was spot on and it just confirms that you've done the right thing.
Excellent. And Brad, I guess that's what your department does all the time as a matter of course, is reviews how they've managed situations.
Absolutely, and there are very good points of Rachel's is to review your plan, and some hazards like storm, bushfire are seasonal. You might want to dust off your plan at the beginning of the season and review it, and also after an incident. Okay,
excellent. And so, Brad, also with you, what happens after the incident, after the area is declared safe? Does DFAS then step back and let other agencies get involved in offering assistance, or what's the role there? Where does the handover happen?
Well, when an incident moves to the recovery stage, we call it transition to recovery. So that is a staged process or graduated process where the incident control is handed over to the relevant authority. In most cases, that is local government. So we don't just drop it on them. We assist and with the transition into the recovery phase.
Okay, excellent. So, Karin, if we're moving into the recovery phase, then where can businesses go to get assistance? We know that the local government's going to help the community more broadly, but where can businesses themselves go to get assistance?
Well, businesses can contact the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and we do provide advice about disaster recovery in the context of how to make sure that your business is actually safe to resume operations. We also provide advice around how to manage people who may have unfortunately been injured as a result of the event, or who may have been injured or affected by participating either in emergency response or some other activity during the event. So there are a variety of different things that employers have to do. There are legislative obligations on employers to provide restricted duties to people who have valid workers' compensation claims. There are also obligations to make sure that any tasks that you might ask people to do when they come back to work are actually safe and not going to expose them to additional risk of injury or harm.
And talking about staff and how we manage staff, Rachel, what about training of staff? We know that you know, some businesses will have volunteers who are registered volunteers and trained, but what about within your own small business? What can you do with regards to training and upskilling staff?
That is a fundamental of preparing for an emergency. So training is, I guess, one of those core things that you do have to do. You can't just have a plan written and put it in the corner or stick a map up on the wall. You actually have to consult with your staff. You have to talk about what could happen in an emergency. You need to identify those key roles in your business and train people in that. And the key roles are things like your first aid officer. I always suggest you have at least 2 people trained. You never know if someone's on holidays or, you know, is away for the day. So I always suggest have at least 2 people trained. Obviously, the higher risk your business is and the more people there is, that needs to be adapted. The numbers need to be adapted based on that. Training in terms of your evacuation staff. So the names that we use are things like your chief wardens or your deputy wardens. So it's really important that these people have been trained to effectively evacuate a business so that they can direct the people safely. They know how to do a sweep of the building, that there's nobody left. They know how to use the fire extinguisher should that be appropriate. So it's about training on what fire extinguisher to use in the right circumstance. It's also about training everybody in your business about how to respond in an emergency. And a lot of those people, what they have to do is just follow the orders of the chief warden. But it's about informing everyone, training everybody. We have a plan. If there's an emergency, this is what we need to do, and everybody needs to know what to do in an emergency. So the training is absolutely a fundamental of being prepared for an emergency.
And what about in some of our smaller locations, some of our rural and remote towns where perhaps that training isn't available? What options are there for businesses who really want to do the right thing and get staff trained up, but feel that they don't have a lot of options locally?
Absolutely. So I find the thing with the regions is that they don't want to see somebody come out and tell them what to do. What really works well in the region is having somebody that is in the region that almost can be a local hero. So somebody that they have identified with, somebody who may volunteer in another capacity in terms of emergency response, but they want to hear the information from this local person. And CCI can absolutely engage with a number of people in the regions to help them be this person to spread the word and be the contact person in the region. As I said, it's about identifying that person who can be the local hero or the local champion to be able to go to those businesses and help them out. What I would also suggest, particularly in the regions, they appreciate there's a lot of information on the internet, but they don't want to see it like that. They want somebody face to face with them, talking to them about this is the advice, this is consulting with them, seeing them, going out to their business, having experience in the regional areas to be able to provide that advice face to face. So it's about identifying that person who can help their business on a face to face basis.
Excellent. And I suppose, Brad, you mentioned local government. I'm assuming a lot of local government officers would have people that manage emergencies?
They do, and their staff are well trained, and local governments often provide training free of charge to communities in different areas. Okay,
so it might be for your regional business to actually ask the question about who's available in your community to provide that assistance.
Jackie, on that note as well, it is something that employers do need to carefully think about the mix of employees that they have, and they may have a wide variety of casual staff who come through depending on where they're based and the kind of work that they do, whether it's seasonal work or casual work, because who you train today may not be who's on your site when the event arises. So if you know that you have got a changeover in your workforce coming up, you need to make sure that any new people are inducted and actually understand as well what it is you need them to do. And depending on where they come from, you may find that there are some different languages that you might need to translate your emergency preparedness information into, or you may need to think of other ways to make sure that on the day of an emergency those people understand what the instructions are and requirements are, if it's not an environment that they're particularly used to.
Corinne, I think that's a really valuable point, because we know that in regional West Australia we have a lot of backpacker labour.
Yes.
We have a lot of seasonal workers, particularly in the agricultural sector. What can someone do if they've only got a backpacker working for them, that perhaps for an 8-week season? You know, obviously you don't want to spend days and days and days training someone if you know they're only going to be there for a short time. Can you give us some short, sharp hints about how you might train someone?
Definitely. I think the thing to do is to make sure that you have a clear picture of what it is that you require people to do, and then have very clear instructions that are able to be presented to whoever might come into your business in a very simple visual way is probably the best thing. Have signage displayed. That's a very quick, easy and very transferable way of getting information across to people who may not necessarily understand all of the nuances that might be in verbal instruction or in written directions, but certainly you would need to have a think about how you can best get the key messages across. And your key message might be, do what we instruct you to do, meet here at this point, at this if there is an emergency. And so if they're the key 3 things that you need people to know, make sure everyone knows those 3 things, and all the other things will be able to be managed on the day.
Excellent. Brad, when we're talking about agriculture, just leading into emergencies and preparedness, do you find that there's sometimes an issue where people don't want to leave premises because they've got livestock, or they want to get access to properties sooner than perhaps you want them to because of they're concerned about their livestock or even pets, I suppose?
Yeah, we do find that a lot, Jackie, and people really place high value on pets and livestock, horses, etc. They're difficult to move. They are a real concern for people. So once again, it's really planning for what that livestock could be exposed to. If you know you're in a bushfire prone area, then it's probably good to have a plan in place where, you know, once you get warning there's a bushfire in the area, you can move that livestock to a safer place.
Okay.
And the same with pets. People are very attached to their pets, and it should be considered in their plan what they're going to do with their pets.
Okay, excellent. So to recap, we're talking today about regional business resilience, and we've talked around a lot of really broad topics. Karin, can you maybe just summarise it into some key points?
Yes, Jackie, the things that people need to think about are people issues. So where will people be? Are some people more vulnerable than others? Who in your business is likely to volunteer, and who will be left behind to help you manage the emergency if it impacts on your business or your premises? You need to think about financial issues. So how will you be able to access your bank account? Will you be able to pay suppliers? Will you be able to continue to make salary payments to your staff? And where will you get information about how to make an insurance claim if you do have some damage or loss? You need to also consider environmental issues, so your workplace, your home, access via roads, residual damage or other types of environmental impacts. So for example, there might be residual smoke in an area which might prevent you being able to go back there. How will you deal with that? And also consider community issues. So what happens in the town? Who is going to be responding? What kind of things are they going to be doing? Who will they be calling on? And which agencies are going to be in your area, and who's going to be available to help you to actually recover after an emergency.
And I mean, talking about community, I know that you know, most regional business owners and farmers in the regions are very much part of their community, and obviously want to look after the members of the community that work for them. Are there other issues that could affect coming back to work, perhaps for some staff who've been involved in an emergency?
Yes, well, depending on the nature of the emergency and the kinds of things that the person was involved in or exposed to, you may actually find that you will have to deal with staff members or family members or people who are part of your business operations who are actually psychologically traumatised or distressed as a result of having been a part of either the disaster or the recovery, or they may themselves have been impacted through a loss of some sort. So being a responsible employer who cares for their staff, as most employers are, there will be an interest in making sure that you do have something in place to provide support to your employees who might need some counselling or some other assistance to help them to process what's happened and to be able to come back to work with the right frame of mind and the ability to come back and be productive and put the event behind them in such a way that they can continue on and also demonstrate the resilience that you're hoping to be able to build through all of your business planning by having early support and early assistance available to people to help them to deal with any traumatic experiences they may have been exposed to.
And I suppose that that situation also applies maybe if your business hasn't been impacted by a disaster or emergency, but people go through personal trauma. So
Yes.
again, that comes into it, I suppose.
It does, and it's part of your planning and your preparation to make sure that you do have people within your business who are going to be as well prepared as they can be, both on an environmental level, in that you've got everything as safe as you can have it in the workplace, but also you've got people who are able to respond to situations with confidence, who know what it is that's likely to happen, what kind of instruction you're likely to give, who's likely to take control, and the sorts of things they can expect if something arises, so that you're not dealing with unexpectedness and you're not dealing with panic.
Okay. So Brad, if we're talking about people and resilience and how we manage people, I'm really interested, what happens when someone is evacuated and they may go to a central evacuation point? Who takes control there, and what facilities are available for your staff that might have been evacuated?
Responsibility for evacuation lies with the Department of Family Services and Child Protection.
Mm-hmm.
And this is because that department has the infrastructure with psychologists, doctors, etc., and a whole network that can deal with it. Also, the evacuation centre will be the Red Cross that registers evacuees.
Mm-hmm.
So any employees that attend there will receive food, water, shelter, all the basic things, and there'll also be emotional support there as well.
Jackie, there are also quite a lot of free resources available for employers, both in the preparation stage and after a situation arises. So places like CCI can provide assistance to help employers to identify potential areas where there may be mental health issues and assist employers to put some plans in place to help employees to deal with those. There's also a vast array of information that's available free via Beyond Blue. CCI is a partner with Beyond Blue and has helped to create employer-friendly materials that are available for employers to use to actually help them to try and understand the kinds of things that are going to be most helpful for employees and staff members who may be distressed because of something work-related or a personal issue.
I suppose a lot of businesses, doesn't matter if they're metro or regional, perhaps take a "it won't happen to me" attitude, and I know that I've certainly been involved in businesses that perhaps don't have as plans involved that they should be, because we always take that "it'll never happen to me" attitude. Rachel, do you see that sometimes when you're visiting businesses, that they perhaps haven't thought through what might happen?
Yeah, and I see it everywhere. It's not something that that's targeted for the regions or metro. It happens everywhere, and it's just what I say to them. It's that you need to make a conscious effort to be prepared. This "it won't happen to me" doesn't cut it anymore, and you actually have a duty to under OSH legislation to make sure that you've identified your hazards, you've assessed them, you've controlled them. And so looking at preparing for an emergency, it's about identifying the emergencies that that may happen to your business. So this whole "it won't happen to me," I see it a little bit, but what I see more, which is I guess much more people being proactive, seeking the information, wanting to make sure that they know that these emergencies could happen, and they seek the advice of what can we do to make sure if it does, we are prepared. So what I do see more in the regions as opposed to metro is that the regions have a stronger sense of community, have a stronger sense of wanting to look after them, look after their neighbours, looking after the other businesses in the community. They don't just think about their own business. They think the regions have a stronger sense of community, and they really it's almost like they're more invested in it. Yep. So, which is sort of why I see more people being proactive in the regions, seeking that, what can I do to be prepared? I guess the difference with regions and the metro is that regional, it's perhaps a little harder to get that information face to face, as I was saying before. Metro have an easier access to those people that can come out and talk to them and provide them that information. In the regions, they want to be consulted, they want that face to face information, they want to hear it from someone they know, they trust, a local hero as such.
Okay. And I suppose perhaps there's some misconceptions, and Brad, you might be able to touch on this, is misconceptions that you know, everything will magically be fixed and everything will magically be restored by the government, or that someone else will come in. I suspect that the regions are probably a little bit more realistic in understanding that you have to do it yourself, because we're probably more used to doing it ourselves. But do you see that sometimes, a misconception that more will happen after a disaster?
Yeah, often we do, Jackie. I think people do have a level of complacency, and they're often surprised when it does happen to them, and they always think, oh, I never thought it would happen to me. Things don't automatically just get fixed up, and sometimes they do. Some things take quite some time to restore things back to normal.
Okay, thanks. So what are our key takeaways if we're talking about regional business resilience? Rachel, what's your key message today?
Okay, I've got a few key messages.
Excellent. Okay,
we need to have a plan. So what that means is we actually need to have a document with how we are going to plan for our response to an emergency. So in this document, we need to talk about the roles, the responsibilities, what to do, where to take, what to take, where to go. We also need to have practical stuff like the first aid kit. The emergency exits need to be lit up. They need to have the fire extinguishers. We need to look at the practicalities of the stuff we need when there's an emergency. And the last one is the training. We need to make sure that everyone, every member of our business, every employee, every volunteer, every staff member knows what to do when there's an emergency. It might just be follow the directions of the chief warden, or it could be make sure we train our people who are responsible in terms of when there's an emergency. So they're my takeaways. Have a document, have a plan, make sure the practical things are there, your fire extinguishers, your escape routes, your first aid kits, and also ensure that all of your staff are trained.
Excellent. So that's all about being prepared.
It's all about being prepared, yes, absolutely.
Brad, what's your take-home message, your key message?
My take-home message, Jackie, would be warning and information. People and businesses should visit the DFES website. Make yourself familiar with the warning system, and if you know there's a storm, flood, bushfire possibility of occurring, make sure you get that information, and it'll advise you when you can activate your plan.
Excellent. Thanks, Brad. And Karin, what's your key message for today?
Well, I think in addition to the messages from Rachel and Brad about keeping people safe, which is really obviously the number one priority, when you're in business, or you're running a home business, or you are running a farm, or any other kind of operation, you really need to think about what could interrupt your business, either for a temporary period or for a longer period, and come up with ways of actually trying to mitigate the likelihood of that happening. And if it does occur, how can you quickly get back up and running again?
So it's about continuity.
Absolutely, about continuity.
How you keep things going.
Yes, and one of the critical things to think about too is, what are your obligations? Be familiar with what it is that you are actually required to do by law, and make sure that you've got those things very clearly understood, and that you've got a plan in place to deal with those things, because the expectation will be that you will meet those requirements.
Thanks, Karin, and thank you to Rachel and to Brad also. Today we've been talking about regional business resilience, and this has been possible thanks to some funding under WA's National Disaster Resilience Program, jointly funded by the WA State Government and the Commonwealth. At the end of this video there will be some important contact information, some phone numbers and some websites. We'll also be running some regional workshops at community resource centres across Western Australia, and we ask you to keep an eye out for those dates at the end of the show. And once again, thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you, Karin.
Thanks,
and
Jackie.
thank you very much for watching.